Hi, I'm Adam, and welcome to part 5 of Beyond Bias, Algorithms in Advertising. In previous episodes, we talked about the bias toward direct response advertising that's embedded in advertising software and even in the human algorithm, which are the processes that media buyers deploy when optimizing campaigns. So it certainly raises the question of why. How did things get the way they are, where there's this persistent direct response bias doesn't necessarily have to exist, right? There are many use cases for advertising, including advertising for the top of the funnel, and it's entirely possible to model and deploy models for those goals. But in reality, everything is biased toward direct response. So to understand how things got the way they are is going to take a few episodes. And this one, which we're going to call Enterprise Scale, introduces the key reason why, which in a word is software. Now, if you work in software, if you're especially if you're a developer, you might want to skip this episode because you'll know all the content. But for the rest of us, it's going to be worth taking 10 minutes to not take software for granted. Now, the norm for people who don't work in software and don't code, certainly the case with me before I founded Chalice, was to take software for granted. That means we open up a piece of software, expect it to work flawlessly. We're frustrated when it doesn't work flawlessly. We wonder why it doesn't have the exact features and functionality we need. And we don't give much thought to what it took to build this software, what makes it run, and which parts of it are changeable and which are not. So a key concept of software that we'll start with is the idea of enterprise scale. Now, enterprise scale is the concept that everything that you build should be able to be built over and over. That is, for any piece of software, in theory, everyone in the world should be able to operate this software without it significantly changing. Now, for that to be true, the software has to have what you'd say is a very robust backend. And software engineers will use metaphors from physical buildings to talk about this. So they call it architecture, and they call the core architecture the most important instructions for how a piece of software operates or interacts with the machine that it runs on. They would call the backend architecture the foundational architecture, low-level architecture to indicate that it's at the bottom of what's built on top of it. And they would call the part that we interact with the high-level architecture or the front end. So if you only experience the front end and only think about the front end, you're sort of like someone who's living in a penthouse apartment on the 75th floor of a beautiful building and never giving much thought to the 74 floors beneath you. And of course, all the connections of that building to the urban infrastructure. So you might wonder, why can't I walk out of my building onto the sidewalk? It's because you're up 75 floors, right? Why can't I change how the electricity or the sewage system or the heating and air conditioning systems work? And the answer is because those are embedded in the foundational architecture and are very difficult to change. Now, there's things you can change in your apartment. You can redecorate it. You might be able to move walls around and change the shape of it and the inside, but you can't change beyond the walls of the building. You can't move it to another part of town. You can't change the things that are connected to the urban infrastructure. So the things you can move in software, those things that are like redecorating, you might in software refer to those as features. Features can be changed and adapted and rebuilt and released. And the things that you can't change, you might say, are hard-coded, mean that they're built into the back end. They're what's holding up what you experience every day. And to change them would be like building an entirely new building. Now, if you're under 30 years old, you spent your entire life within a long cycle of software development, right? There's been 30 years of very intense investment, iteration, and advancement of both the infrastructure around software and of software applications themselves. If you're over 30, you might remember the world before software, which was a very different business environment. I would I often recommend the book Shoe Dog, which is by the CEO of Nike, as an example of what it was like to run a startup business before enterprise capital. So when Phil Knight was growing Nike in the 70s and even into the 80s, there was no enterprise capital who shared his vision of everybody in the world owning multiple pairs of sneakers and wearing them everywhere, including to work. He had to take his money just from traditional banks who have a very different risk profile than an enterprise capitalist. And a lot of the book is about the tension and drama this caused because he never had a startup capital. It was essentially risking the entire business with every shipment of Nike sneakers for many, many years. So that's a dramatic book. Starting in the 90s, largely because of the success of a few companies, the biggest of which is Microsoft, you start to have enterprise capital investment to build software. And the way this investment came in and what they were trying to build is very specific and different than the world before. So by the 90s, Microsoft was earning over $1 billion per year, though the number of employees who worked for Microsoft was still well under 50,000 people. Now, this is something that had never happened before, a relatively small company being enormously profitable. Another thing that was peculiar about Microsoft is it didn't have a public-facing brand for the most part. The public wasn't aware of Microsoft products for many, many years. The software was embedded as sort of an urban infrastructure within home computers. And whether you bought a Dell or an IBM, there was Microsoft operating software inside of it, and you could run the same applications on a IBM or a Dell because they all ran on the Microsoft platform. This is key to what made Microsoft so extremely profitable in the beginning. And then when they started to add applications, what we know today is the Microsoft Office suite, it started with Excel and soon included Outlook and Internet Explorer, that the applications and the operating system worked together and both advanced each other's business goals by interlocking and fitting together. So the reason these businesses become so extremely profitable is that they're the same thing every time, right? As soon as Microsoft releases an operating system, first it was DOS, and then there was a series of Windows applications, they'd make the same thing over and over for every computer user on the planet, the exact same way. So the cost of creating more and more of them was close to zero. And when they made Office Suite, same thing again. The cost of producing more and more of them was close to zero, right? This wasn't a artisanal manufactured product. This was a piece of software that could just be copied and shipped out and sold for the same price as the first one. So Microsoft as a platform and as an application company starts to have really enormous margins, which means a very big difference between the cost of making the product and the value to the marketplace of that product, right? The price they could sell it for. So this starts to drive a huge amount of investment capital because that's such a great and profitable business. Many people say, if only we could invest in a company that's going to become a platform, then we can enjoy the same kind of returns that Microsoft and their early investors saw in this first decade of enterprise software. Now, a challenge for Microsoft that becomes more challenging over time is every time they wanted to improve these products, they had to improve both the operating system and everything in the Microsoft suite together, and then get everyone to buy new versions of both again. And this started to happen every few years with operating system and updates like Windows 95 and Windows Vista and a bunch of forgotten releases. But what you should take away from that is when you have a platform architecture and applications on top of it, it's a very big deal to change it. The business model calls for everything to work the same way every time. And it's not just one thing sitting on the 75th floor. It's an entire architecture underneath that to hold up the building, the back end, and an urban infrastructure that's architected on the ground and below that allows these applications and many other applications to run, to interact together, and to not cause your computer to crash when you run them at the same time or switch to a different machine. So all of that is to say that once you've built something of such scale, you have something that's sort of like a city with big buildings and is very hard to move and rearrange, and that relies on things happening the same way every time. The way data moves, the way instructions are called, the order that things happen has to be the same all the time for the magic of all the beautiful apartments that we experience as flawless applications to work. Now, this insistence on stability and sameness that is summed up in the phrase enterprise scale is so deeply embedded in the culture of software that they're almost different worlds between us who use software and think, can't this just change? And the world of software architects who know exactly what is hard-coded and what's at the level of feature and can change. So as we continue, we'll refer back to this episode to remind people of the demands of enterprise scale, of the way it interlocks with the business need of the investors in business, and the way that it infuses the entire culture of software with a very strong, unbreakable belief that anything worth building is worth building to enterprise scale, to be locked down, hard-coded in ways that will allow it to be very easily replicated without change. So we'll start to apply this at advertising in the next episode. As always, write to me with any questions at adam@chalice. This is Beyond Bias, Algorithms in Advertising, and we'll see you next time.